Welcome to Flashbackpackers, the show that's dedicated to backpacking across the world. This will be episode number 1, the seminal, I guess you would say, pilot episode. Today, I, your intrepid host, Chris Shapercutter, am going to be going solo dolo on a trip with you to the country of New Zealand, a popular spot for backpackers, known as sort of almost the end of the hippie trail, starting in Europe and ending halfway around the world, whether you're from Europe and you're going over the Asian continental landmass, or whether you are from the United States and maybe taking one of the longest flights in the entire world to get there, or whether you are from some other part of the world. Certainly this is not excluded to Europe and North America. You could even be a native New Zealander trying to find out a little bit more about your country. In full disclosure, I will mostly be drawing information from Lonely Planet as well as my own experiences. I eventually hope to get guests on this podcast, as well as maybe just have a little more formal structure. As again, I said, this is the pilot episode. Well, anyway, let's get to it. The country of New Zealand is an island, or some might say islands, country consisting of the North Island and the South Island, very uniquely named, and a number of outlying islands that are much smaller than either of these. Each of the North Island and the South Island, I believe, are about somewhere in size between Ireland and Great Britain, though combined, obviously, they would be larger than either of the two. The size, again, is about the same size as California, having only 4 million people. It's mostly agrarian, with a scattering of medium and a few larger cities. The only city over 1 million people is Auckland. Again, I realized early on we're getting into some of the demographics, but I just kind of want to paint a picture of what New Zealand is. For example, unlike Australia or the United States or even a China, which have multiple climate patterns throughout most of the country, really most of New Zealand is marine west coast, that being similar to Washington in the United States or England in Europe. Really large parts of Europe, particularly northwestern Europe, are marine west coast. So the temperature generally stays at a fairly stable pattern, not normally getting above 80 degrees in the summertime, and there are numerous regions that get below freezing in the wintertime, but for the most part, sort of the low-lying areas and coastal regions are mostly damp and cool. What else about New Zealand? Well, I guess the largest city is Auckland, New Zealand, followed by Wellington, and then Christchurch, and then you get into a whole bunch of different cities like Dunedin and Invercargill and Hamilton. But we're not just here to list cities, we're here to talk about backpacking. So, as I mentioned, the flights from anywhere in the Western world outside of Australia are going to be very long and often very expensive. This is often a point of not really contention, but just a discouraging point to people looking to visit the country. Secondly, as I hold as one of my tenets, really traveling can be cheap on the shoestring almost anywhere, even in places like Fiji and Samoa, or even say like a Monaco or Las Vegas. There's endless options for cheap places, just because the tourist industry or the tourism industry, or hopefully what we'll call the travel industry, because we're not just tourists, we as backpackers are travelers. Our life experiencers, even though that's not a word. People in that industry know that there are people like us that don't want to merely go to a place to escape the world and to spend a large amount of money to be secluded away from experience. And essentially just it's not our lifestyle. They know that there are people like us that want to maybe spend a little less money but be able to see what the rest of the world lives like. Or if it is a tourist experience for you, a tourist experience that maybe has some bells and whistles, but not the bells and whistles that are just the luxury goods and just kind of looking to throw money. Okay, so New Zealand. I am saying a lot. We'll start in the northern region of Auckland, New Zealand, a city of just over 1 million people, 1.3, I believe, actually, in the metropolitan area. It's known as the City of Islands, specifically because there is a peninsula, which I believe is listed somewhere in here, that essentially juts off from the northern part of New Zealand. I'm sure you will see it if you look at a map, and connects it to the rest of the northern island, at which point its narrowest point is more or less the city of Auckland. Meaning that, and by narrowest point, I don't mean the end of the peninsula, I mean in the neck of the peninsula. This meaning that there are two bays, one on either side. Let's see. Well, there's Mananaku Harbor and Hauraki Gulf. One thing I noticed that when I was in Auckland, New Zealand, was the proliferation of boats. I believe that Auckland has one of the highest, if not the highest, boat ownerships per capita in the entire world. This does not necessarily mean that everyone in Auckland is rich. It just means that the society is set up as sort of a boating society. And when I mean boats, I'm not really talking necessarily about yachts, though there were a few in the harbor. But I'm not necessarily talking about just like outright motorboats either. I'm talking about small houseboats, boats that you could spend the day out on one of the harbors in, going around one of the many beautiful islands, which are technically still volcanically active, but are, for the most part, dormant. It's not like the islands of Hawaii where they're constantly erupting. That should be a spot that's mentioned throughout the New Zealand podcast, in that New Zealand is highly seismically active, meaning high numbers of volcanoes and earthquakes. Though, for the most part, it's not a natural disaster you should necessarily worry about unless it happens, which I know is sort of an odd thing to say, but I think a lot of people often get scared by natural disasters because they see, graphic images on television, and those are certainly real, and those things certainly happened. There was a earthquake, I believe, in 2006 or 7 that happened no, it was later. I think it was like 2008 or 9. That happened in Christchurch, New Zealand, and almost leveled the entire city, or if not leveling it, at least creating a massive amount of damage. Now, if you see this, and that is the only image of New Zealand that you have, you don't realize that things like that are sort of a earthquakes aren't once in a century occurrences, but earthquakes of that magnitude are a once in a century occurrence. Another way to think of it, if you're from the continental United States, is everyone likes going to California. Everybody knows that there are earthquakes in California, but that really doesn't dissuade people from taking vacations to California. Okay, moving down the coast. Let's get our big old map out here. I'm just kind of perusing Lonely Planet. To be honest, I didn't really prep too much ahead of time. Other spots in the North Island, Lake Taupo, Taupo. It's the largest lake in all of New Zealand, which is saying something, considering that there are numerous lakes all over New Zealand. That it's really because of the rain and because of the high amount of mountains, the mountains being associated with the seismological activity that I previously talked about. There are really lakes all over the country, but Lake Taupo is one of the most beautiful. There are Maori carvings that are within the lake itself. Sort of, if you're a sort of pre-European history buff of the native peoples of various lands, the Maori being the native peoples of New Zealand. That would be interesting. There are numerous or not really sea cliffs, I guess you call them lake cliffs that are there, and the water is just sort of very relaxing. It's not dirty. It's very sort of this deep blue, clean color. Moving a little north, there's Rotorua, Rotorua. The reason I'm spelling it out is because I'm not necessarily sure that I'm saying it correctly. But this is sort of the Yellowstone of New Zealand. They have mud pots, geysers, just everything associated sort of with the kind of seismological activity or the magmic, like magma and stuff, activity that exists when the Earth crust gets very thin above the magma shelf. But not necessarily exploding in a volcano and with lava and everything. See, we got Napier. This is sort of the Art Deco city of New Zealand. The interesting thing about this was that Napier was destroyed in an earthquake in the 1920s, I believe, in either the 1920s or the 1930s. And the style of architecture that was popular during this time period was Art Nouveau, was Expressionism, was now I'm having trouble remembering what it's called, Art Deco, sort of what you see in the Chrysler Building or a lot of the skyscrapers around Manhattan in the 1930s. Obviously, Napier is not filled with skyscrapers, but many of the buildings that were rebuilt were almost exclusively in this style, which makes it one of the few cities on Earth that really not just has a few buildings like this, but is the dominant sort of theme of the town, to the point that it's become recognized for that. You got Mount Napier's on the east coast of New Zealand, New Zealand's North Island. If you go across, almost directly across on the west coast is Mount Taranaki, which is, or also known as Mount Egmont. Mount Taranaki, I assume, is the name that was given to it when the Maori were starting to be recognized that maybe they had some propriety to the land of New Zealand, and that a bunch of white people coming in was not the best. You move south, you got Wellington. This is the most southern city on the island, being where it is where Flight of the Conchords is located. But most people who are not indie parody song fans know it for Weta Studios, or more famously, what Weta Studios is known for is creating the Lord of the Ring movies, Peter Jackson, etc. So you should go see their studios. You can also see the National Capitol there. It's known as sort of a university town, kind of. This might be a little self-important on their part, but Wellington see themselves sort of as the San Franciscans of the country of New Zealand, kind of the more artsy, kind of government-y group compared to sort of the business-driven city of Auckland. Okay, well that's there's some more stuff that I could talk about in the North Island. I mean, there's you want to get into it, this could be a 10-hour podcast, but just to cut away sort of from the geographic angle, I think we should look a little bit more at kind of what it's like to be a backpacker in New Zealand. Kind of a couple things you want to figure is where you're going to stay. Hostels are very much available. Specifically, when I was there, that was probably the main method of people that were on sort of a shoestring budget for staying. Of course, since then, Airbnb has become quite popular. You can find it all over New Zealand. One thing about New Zealand is that they have okay internet connection, but it's not as good as a lot of the East Asian countries or large parts of the United States or Europe. Probably a good comparison would be to some of the more developed Eastern European countries, such as, I don't know, like a Croatia or Slovakia or an Estonia or something like that. That being said, though, New Zealand actually has a higher standard of living than those people. It's just partially because they're so isolated and just for various other factors. They're not exactly a world leader on telecommunications. What else? I guess I should mention some prices for the hostels. It is a little bit expensive. I'm just going to do this in American dollars. Really, it's about 25. You really can't find a hostel for less than 20 in most places in New Zealand. So I'd say $25 is a solid bet. If you get up into like a 4-bedroom hostel or you want some specific amenities, you might be looking at the $30 range. Airbnb runs the full gamut. I'm sure you can rent houses, but for many people, it's more like, another site, couch surfing. It's like couch surfing in that you are just staying with people. Now, I would, to be 100% honest, I did not participate in Airbnb when I was there. So I would imagine that the prices are similar to prices that you would see in other Western developed countries. Let's see, what else? Work. I know that if you're under 30 years of age, you can get a New Zealand working holiday visa. Me being an American, it is one of the few countries on earth that offer a working holiday visa to Americans. For the most part, for whatever reason, that seems to be kind of an exclusive club of Western European countries, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, and a smattering of East Asian countries like Japan and stuff. But yeah, so you can get a working holiday visa to go there. Really, a lot of the work is kind of just menial. I mean, it's not like East Asia where you're set up with a specific predispositioned job category just because of where you are, who you came from. Of course, East Asia, that's mostly teaching English. There are a lot of jobs sort of in, working in hotels. There's a lot of agrarian jobs. A lot of sort of like, you're not going to find you might parlay a part-time job into a career, but there are very few careerist type jobs that are looking to hire somebody for 3 months. So just know what to expect there. Let's get back to the geography angle of it. So we'll move into the South Island. I guess before I get too specific into geography, because I tend to kind of focus on just the geographic angle rather than stepping back and just kind of taking stock of the country. A couple things that New Zealand is known for, and I'll be talking about this eminently because its largest wine growing area is in the north of the South Island. But as I said, wine growing is a huge industry in New Zealand. If you're a little bit of a wino or a little bit of a wine expert, depending on how you self-identify yourself, even though that's often the same thing, The Marlborough wine region, as well as the Hawke's Bay and even the Otago region around Christchurch, or around around Queenstown, are large wine growing regions. New Zealand does produce some red wine, but really for export, and really kind of what they're world renowned for, and where their best wines come from, are the white wines, specifically the varietal Sauvignon Blanc. I think New Zealand is considered probably the preeminent Sauvignon Blanc wine producer in the entire world. Outside of that, they're known for producing sheep. I mentioned early on in the podcast that there are about a little over 4 million people in New Zealand. I believe there's something like 50 to 60 million sheep that exist in the country. Many of these sheep are obviously raised for export, either for their wool or for their meat, often going to wealthy Central Asian, not really Central Asian, I guess you call it Southwest Asian, or what we know as the Middle East, even though that's sort of a European-centric word nowadays. Countries that traditionally eat lamb in large numbers, as well as really Europe. You occasionally see New Zealand lamb in the United States, but it's certainly not the main market for New Zealand lamb and wool products. What else? Well, obviously, there's a huge number of national parks, with it being as large as California, but only having 4 million people. The tallest peak is Mount Cook, which I believe is just under 14,000 feet. There's a lot of skiing, a lot of seafood. It's definitely, as I mentioned early on in the podcast, it's sort of a cool market, if not cold market environment. People do go like surfing in New Zealand, but you always have to wear a wetsuit to keep yourself from hypothermia. If you're expecting sun, beach, and tropical drinks, well, you can go to the South Pacific, other parts of the South Pacific, but New Zealand is just too far south in the South Pacific to really accommodate to those needs. Okay, so the South Island, I mentioned the wine growing region of the Marlborough wine growing region that produces all the crazy popular Sauvignon Blancs in the north part of the island. You also have, I guess the biggest city is Christchurch, the third biggest city in New Zealand, which I had previously mentioned. Other cities include Dunedin and Invercargill. Both of them having, I feel, much more of a, they just feel less touched by what modern New Zealand is, to the degree that the South Island, it feels like it felt like in Auckland and what I've seen of Wellington. Both those cities have more like their predominant buildings are like modern buildings, like this. Is it the Sky Tower? I believe it's called the Sky Tower in Auckland, as well as sort of the Beehive, or sort of the kind of modern tenement buildings, or what do they call those things? Like the 5 and 6 story buildings that are kind of chic along the riverfront, or along the harbor front in Wellington. Really, a lot of the South Island, the predominant buildings tend to be buildings that are 100 years old, that are either churches or old like civic buildings that have not just the 1920s like Napier, but really sort of the old English feel to it, I guess you'd say. There's also much more of a Scottish influence in the South Island. Just in, actually, the way that they speak is slightly more with a brogue. I believe that's how you even pronounce it. The speech patterns of the Scottish. A lot more island or a lot more lakes in the south. I mentioned Lake Taipo, which is in the center of the North Island, but it's really the only predominant lake in the north part of the island. In the South Island, you have a lot of lakes, a lot of which are glacier fed. And it's kind of interesting because you'll have these big lakes that are fairly right next to one another. I mean, we're talking lakes that are, let's see if I can get a scale here, that might be a mile or two wide and 10 or 15 miles long, or even longer. And the interesting thing is that these lakes come in all shades of blue, depending on the glacier that fed them and specifically the type of rock that went into these glaciers. So it's pretty cool area. A lot of the sheep raising is done in the southern island just because it's less populated. I believe 3/4 of the population is in the North Island, but a lot of the well, it's hard to say because the North Island is very scenic and beautiful, but just relatively a lot of what people want to see is in the South Island because it's even more beautiful. I would take the North Island over, I don't know, Indiana or Iowa, I guess you could say, pretty much any day of the week. But the South Island is truly spectacular. Moving down in the South Island, we have the popular tourist backpacker area of Queenstown. It's known as sort of the adventure capital of New Zealand. Bungee jumping being invented in New Zealand, as well as you can participate in events like skydiving, or they have like these speedboats that they're in addition to the lakes, they have many sort of like kind of shallow spring-fed or glacier-fed rivers. And they get these boats that only have like a draft of, a couple feet, if that. And then they'll get these big fans on the back of them. They're like fan boats. And you'll get going like 50, 60 miles an hour, which I know doesn't seem that fast, but when you're on a boat, like the boat with a big fan on it in the middle of the river and can take like all these kind of turns and twists, and it really feels almost like you're on some sort of natural made, though the boat isn't natural made, but some sort of nature made roller coaster ride. They also have, I mentioned bungee jumping, slower things you can do. You can go fishing. There's of course hiking. The Fiordland National Park is one of I believe maybe 2 or 3 World Heritage Sites in New Zealand. I believe there's one other one that's of natural origin, and then one that is like a sacred site to the Maoris. So yeah, one of the things I'd always like to do is, interestingly enough, this is kind of a little indulgent on my part, but most of the trails in Fiordland National Park are connected by lakes. And so there's actually a way that you could see all of Fiordland National Park by if you had like some sort of like blow up raft that you could carry on your back when you're not rafting. You could see all of Fiordland National Park by either rafting across the lakes or hiking along its trails, which I think is pretty amazing. I have been to Milford Sound. Milford Sound is, Fiordland National Park is, what was I going to say? It's appropriately named. It's mostly made of fjords, similar to the fjords that exist in Norway. And many of the lakes around this area are actually created in the same pattern, that being glaciers that carved canyons into the landscape across mountains that are thousands of feet high. So that has to show you exactly how strong these glaciers were, and just how much force of power they had. And so many of them go sheer up thousands of feet, or if not sheer, on a very steep incline, and is really sort of the jagged tooth southwest corner of New Zealand. So yeah, so probably the most famous of these is Milford Sound. I've been there. It was raining. Something particularly about that part of New Zealand is, as I mentioned at the top, New Zealand is very rainy, is very sort of cool climate. You know, a lot of ferns. I should get into the fauna in a second, but that's probably one of the most the wettest area of New Zealand. So just make sure you pack a poncho, pack a raincoat, make sure you have plenty of dry clothes. If you're going around with a pack, like backpacking in the sense of like outdoor, like wilderness backpacking, you would probably want to pack most of your stuff. Your bag could probably get wet, but everything inside the bag you want to put inside an additional, either, you know, like garbage bag or some sort of plastic container to keep it from getting wet. About some of the flora and fauna of New Zealand. They have the kiwis, which are these little tiny birds. Something interesting about New Zealand is until the Maori came, I guess we're going to do a little bit of history and biology here. The Maori, New Zealand was one of the last areas on Earth that was discovered by humankind. It's estimated that it was in about 1200 AD. So, I mean, you think how late that is on the time scale, obviously. The Roman Empire, Jesus, all of the Eastern Chinese dynasties, a good chunk of the Middle Ages had all happened in human habitation until this little known group that were a seafaring group that discovered most of the South Pacific, starting off in Melanesia and Micronesia and then heading east using the stars. This had nothing to do with Western influence. This was all under their own guise. Eventually came to the quite large but isolated country or land that we now know as New Zealand. Now, the reason I bring this up when it comes to the fauna is that there were no natural mammalian predators in New Zealand that existed prior to human discovery. And so what essentially happened is they had no protections against, say, like snakes or rats or certain types of bugs or ferrets or just any sort of the invasive species. So many of the fauna of New Zealand died out, and the ones that still exist, like the kiwi, like the I'm going to do a deep draw, but there's a number of birds that exist there, as well as native insects. That even the ones that are not extinct are in critical condition. But yeah, so where was I going with that? Well, I guess the fauna of New Zealand is kind of unique and interesting, it being primarily bird life prior to Western settlement. I am having trouble remembering. I think it's like an egod or something. There were numerous birds that existed that were larger than today's ostriches. There were birds that were flying birds. You know, the ones that were larger than ostriches were flightless birds, but there were ones that were the size of ostriches that had like 15-foot wingspans, you know, like predator birds. So it's just all very interesting. Of course, the Maori were sort of usurped by the Europeans in the late 1700s, though Europeans viewed them as sort of more civilized. I don't think they viewed them more civilized, but they because of their fighting prowess and some of the things that were similar to Maoris to Westerners, though developed independently, I guess you'd say. Just some of the thought processes or whatever, or some of the makeup of daily life, if you will, living in villages compared to the big comparison would be to the Aborigines who led a life almost completely. I mean, we're getting into Australia here, but almost completely different from that of New Zealand or from Maoris. or Europeans who discovered them, I guess I should say. But anyway, the Europeans kind of had some admiration for the Maori, but that certainly didn't prevent them from taking their land. Now the situation is much better. I think a lot of people consider the Maori still a marginalized race, but only marginally marginalized, if that makes any sense. There is a higher rate of alcoholism, a higher rate of joblessness. I believe Maori die younger than many Westerners do. But for the most part, Maori have rights in modern society and really are not. I mean, there are sections of Maori that are marginalized people, but there are huge chunks of Maori that both are assimilated in a way that's good, that they can participate in modern society, but also hold pride of their traditional beliefs. Okay, well, I guess we didn't really talk too much about the specifics of backpacking. Oh yeah, back to the fauna. Kind of jumping around a little bit here. Of course, the oceans are teeming with things that can kill you. Now, I know for a fact that sharks almost never attack humans, but if you are afraid of things that are in the deep dark blue, then New Zealand might be a little bit of a scary place for you. Let's see if I can find anything else. Let's take another look through LP and see if I missed anything. Of course, Edmund Hillary, I just saw his picture here, is a New Zealander. Him learning to climb on the peaks of New Zealand, but later being the first man that climbed Mount Everest. Let's see. Yeah, I think we're just going to wrap it up at that. Again, in the future, I'd like to talk a little bit more of the backpacking angle of it. Many hot springs. Yeah, I didn't mention anything about that. But I'm sure we'll get to that in later episodes. And if we want to do another episode of New Zealand sometime later down the line where we talk about different aspects of New Zealand that I didn't cover in this first broadcast, well, we certainly have the right to do that. All right, you guys, this has been Flashbackpacking. Why am I saying it like a robot? This has been Flashbackpacking, or Flashbackpacker, or I forget what I even called the show. But we'll figure it out. This is the pilot episode, so we'll work out the kinks later. All right, see you guys. Listen in for some more episodes later.